For the first time, Afghanistan, so often on the receiving end of British firepower, itself became the principal aggressor. The new king of Afghanistan saw Britain, exhausted by war, facing unrest in India. He called another jihad, took his chance, and invaded British India through the Khyber Pass. Although Britain saw off this unexpected aggression, they suffered twice as many casualties as the Afghans. But with Russia no longer the threat of old, Britain saw less need for an interest in Afghanistan and granted the Afghans full independence. But what Afghanistan did with that independence was the opposite of what the British expected. The new king, Amanullah, revealed himself to be a modernizer. The British policy was really to keep Afghanistan locked in the Middle Ages. The last thing they wanted was Afghanistan to change and modernise. And then suddenly, in 1919, modernity came. British ideas came to Afghanistan against Britain's will. And this great process of modernisation came not through the empire, came not through British bayonets, but through an Afghan king. King Amanullah ruled from this extravagant palace in a European style which he built on the outskirts of Kabul, and he championed a new modernising intellectual elite in Afghanistan. But the country that he was determined to transform had changed little in the century that had passed since Britain first took an interest here. It was a country with almost blanket illiteracy, a fragmented country of isolated villages and mountain valleys under feudal rule, the way Britain had found it and left it. Dreaming of modernity in 1927, Amanullah embarks on a grand European tour, the first such trip by an Afghan ruler. The Afghan king arrived in Britain for a full state visit. The flags were out, and a slightly anxious British government responded in time-honoured fashion by taking him to shop for guns and for cars, which his impoverished country could hardly afford. And when he toured the Rolls-Royce factory, he bought a fleet of cars to take back home. It started a long love affair between Afghan royalty and Rolls-Royce. And this car was later part of their fleet, now owned by businessman Richard Rainsford. For an Afghan, possessing this car really shows that you're part of an international group. You're no longer part of an isolated country at the other end of the world.
Well, that's right. He was a very sophisticated man. When he went to Europe in 1928, he was not just looking for Rolls-Royce cars. He was looking really to have means to be inspired by the West, to how he could modernise his very backward country. And therefore the Rolls-Royce trip to the Derby Works was part of that overall quest for inspiration and for modernisation.
A car like this, at the time, was a pretty expensive thing.
It would cost as much as a house in Fulham. About £1,500 for the chassis and another £1,500, even more, up to £2,000 for the body, depending on how exotic a body is ordered by the excited owner.
What would an Afghan have felt looking at this kind of car?
It would be like looking at something driven to the space shuttle, I imagine, to an Afghanistan farmer or peasant.
I think it's tempting today when we look at a car like this to imagine Amanullah as some sort of corrupt dictator who was spraying money around on Rolls Royces. But in fact, really, this is part of his love of technology or machinery. It's as though he's returning to the country with a jet engine or a new computer system. He's coming back with whole new interests in railways and printing machines and mining technology and medicine. But for the conservatives in Afghanistan, this is all very dangerous and very dubious. The big story that's spreading through the streets when he arrives is he's bringing back a new machine to turn human corpses into soap. Amanullah was just beginning to discover how conservative his country still was. Wild rumours were circulating about how he had become a Catholic, ate pork, drank alcohol, became perceived as a foreigner in his own land, attempting to impose a foreign ideology on his own people. It's easy to laugh at Amanullah, and indeed there's a lot that you can laugh at him for. For example, he gathered the tribal elders and insisted they wore pinstripe trousers and Western jackets. But there was also a highly developed, serious program of reform. In fact, the most radical program for state transformation in Afghanistan came from an Afghan. He wanted parliamentary elections, a progressive constitution, education particularly for women. And in the end, when photographs were circulated in the bazaar of his wife the Queen, with her head uncovered, with pearls over a plunging neckline, he had to flee. The wheels of that new Rolls-Royce spinning vainly in the snow, to exile in Italy. It is ironic, when today we're concerned with a powerful hold of Islam and the problems of establishing democracy in that country, that the only attempt in this whole period to modernise and democratise Afghanistan didn't come from British rule, but from the Afghans themselves. So why did the British go into Afghanistan in the 19th century? It wasn't really about Afghanistan in the end. It was about the fears of empire, fear of empty space, fear of the Russians, fear in the end about their own credibility, their pride. In the second film, two superpowers come calling, and these armies invade Afghanistan not just to protect their selfish strategic aims, but also with the objective of bringing profound social change and reshaping Afghanistan more in their own image. And the result, for the people of Afghanistan and their invaders, was to be even greater horror and tragedy. If you were going to pass a message to the American and British troops today, what would you say to them?
Быстрее вернуться живыми, здоровыми домой.
سر اسلام فرضاً فکر تا که زنده هستش شما جهاد کنید ما میکنیم